Whispers in Salem. Ivy Morin stared at her father, disbelief washing over her. She had always believed he never knew his mother, that she had disappeared from his life long before he could remember. For years, this was the family truth, the story that had shaped Ivy's understanding of her lineage. But here they were, in the kitchen of her childhood home, with her father avoiding her gaze. "I lied," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "My mother is alive. She's been living in Salem all this time." Ivy leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation heavy in the air. "Salem?" she repeated, almost as if saying the word aloud would help her make sense of it. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Her father looked down, fidgeting with his hands. "It wasn't something I wanted you to know," he said. "It's complicated. I didn't want her world to be part of your life." Her world? What did that even mean? Ivy had always considered herself a logical person. She was an architect, a planner, someone who liked clear structures and answers. But nothing about this revelation felt clear. All it did was raise more questions, questions her father was obviously unwilling to answer. "I need to meet her," Ivy said, her voice resolute. "I need to know what you've been hiding." Her father's sigh was long and tired, but he didn't stop her. There was no use in trying to deter Ivy once she had made up her mind. Within the week, she was packed and on her way to Salem, her heart buzzing with curiosity and uncertainty. Chapter 1. The Hidden Truth. Salem was nothing like Ivy expected. She had heard about its historical roots, the witch trials, the quaint charm of the New England town. But arriving in late October, during the height of the Halloween festivities, she found the town alive with a unique blend of eerie history and modern excitement. The streets were filled with tourists in costumes, jack-o'-lanterns flickered on nearly every porch, and the crisp air carried the scent of apples, wood smoke, and mystery. Ivy checked into a small inn at the edge of the town square, a place that felt like it had stepped out of a different time. The innkeeper, a middle-aged woman with streaks of silver in her hair, offered a friendly smile as she handed Ivy the key to her room. "You're here for the Halloween festivities?" the woman asked, her voice warm. "Not exactly," Ivy replied, keeping her reasons for being in Salem to herself. "Just visiting family." The woman's smile faltered slightly, and Ivy could have sworn she saw a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "Family, huh? Well, enjoy your stay." As Ivy made her way to her room, she couldn't help but wonder if the woman had guessed something about her, something connected to the whispers she had overheard since arriving. But she brushed it off and focused on the task ahead, meeting her grandmother. The address her father had given her led to a large, ivy-covered Victorian house in the heart of the festive district. The house stood at the edge of a bustling street, its towering presence shrouded in shadows, even in the daylight. The windows were framed with dark green shutters, and the ivy clung to the brick like it had been there for centuries. Ivy stared at the house, a knot forming in her stomach. There was something about it, something that felt alive. It was as if the house was watching her, waiting for her to step closer. With a deep breath, she walked up the cobblestone path and knocked on the large oak door. Moments later, it creaked open, and Ivy came face to face with a woman who could only be her grandmother. Chapter 2. The Whispers of Salem. Her grandmother was nothing like Ivy had imagined. The woman before her was tall, elegant, with silver hair that fell in soft waves around her shoulders. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, sparkled with warmth and a hint of something else, something that Ivy couldn't quite place. She looked Ivy up and down with a knowing smile before opening the door wider. "Ivy," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "I've been expecting you." Ivy felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "You have?" Her grandmother's smile deepened. "Of course. Come in, child. We have much to talk about." The inside of the house was as grand and mysterious as the outside. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and curious artifacts. The air smelled faintly of herbs, and the floors creaked beneath Ivy's feet, as if the house itself was aware of her presence. Ivy noticed that the decor in the home wasn't typical. It was eclectic, filled with items that seemed to hold their own stories. A tarnished brass mirror hung above the mantel, catching the light in an unusual way, and the wallpaper seemed to shift with the shadows, giving the room a sense of timelessness. As they sat down in the parlor, Ivy couldn't help but notice the faint whispers she had heard earlier in the town seemed to follow her here. It wasn't the bustling chatter of tourists or the Halloween revelry. It was quieter, like a soft murmuring on the edges of her consciousness, and she couldn't quite place where it was coming from. Her grandmother poured them both tea, her movements graceful and deliberate. "You must have questions," she said, looking at Ivy with those piercing green eyes. Ivy nodded, gripping the cup of tea like it was a lifeline. "I do. My father, he never told me about you. He said he didn't want your world to be part of my life. What did he mean by that?" Her grandmother's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more serious. "Your father has always been hesitant to embrace the truth about who we are, about who I am." Ivy's heart raced. "And who are you?" There was a long pause before her grandmother spoke again. "I am many things, Ivy, but I am first and foremost your grandmother. The rest, well, that's for you to discover in time." Ivy frowned. "What do you mean? The rest of what?" Her grandmother set down her tea, folding her hands in her lap. "There are whispers in this town, Ivy. Whispers that have followed me for years. People talk, they wonder, some even fear. But the truth is, I don't give them answers." "Whispers?" Ivy echoed. "What are they whispering about?" Her grandmother smiled faintly, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Oh, you'll hear them soon enough." Chapter 3. Meeting Grandmother. Over the next few days, Ivy spent her time with her grandmother, learning more about the woman she had never known. Her grandmother was kind, thoughtful, and undeniably mysterious. She never gave direct answers to Ivy's questions, always speaking in riddles or half-truths. It was frustrating, but also intriguing. The house itself was just as curious. Ivy began to notice small things, objects that seemed to move on their own, doors that opened just before her grandmother approached them, and the subtle way the house seemed to respond to her grandmother's presence. If she needed something, it appeared. If she was about to walk into a room, the door would creak open. It was as if the house was tied to her grandmother's needs, like an extension of her will. Ivy tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe the house was just old and creaky, full of drafts and quirks that explained the strange occurrences. But the more time she spent there, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that there was something more, something deeper going on. One afternoon, as they sat in the parlor, Ivy finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she arrived. "Are you a witch?" Her grandmother looked up from the book she was reading, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Is that what they're saying in town?" Ivy hesitated. "Well, yes. There are whispers. People seem to think you might be." Her grandmother chuckled softly. "People have always whispered, Ivy, especially during Halloween. This town loves its stories." "So it's not true?" Her grandmother didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her book and stood, walking over to the window. "There are many kinds of magic in this world, Ivy. Some people see it, others don't. Some believe in it, and others, well, they'd rather not." Ivy frowned. "That doesn't really answer my question." Her grandmother turned to face her, a gentle smile on her lips. "No, I suppose it doesn't. But I think you'll find the answer for yourself in time." Chapter 4. Discovering the house's connection. As the days passed, Ivy began to notice the house responding to her as well. It wasn't just her grandmother who seemed connected to it. There were moments when Ivy could feel the house shifting around her, offering her things she didn't know she needed until they appeared. A book would fall off a shelf just as she thought of it. a door would creak open, leading her to a room she hadn't explored yet. The house, it seemed, was not just tied to her grandmother's needs. It was starting to respond to Ivy, too. One evening, Ivy found herself wandering through the halls, following a strange pull she couldn't quite explain. She ended up in a small, dimly lit room she had never noticed before. The walls were lined with old, dusty tomes, and the air smelled faintly of incense. On a table in the center of the room was a journal. Ivy picked it up, her fingers brushing over the worn leather cover. It looked ancient, the pages yellowed with age. As she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. The journal was filled with writings about Salem, about the history of the town, the people, and, most intriguingly, about her grandmother. The entries were cryptic, detailing rituals and ceremonies that had taken place long ago, during the time of the witch trials. Ivy's grandmother's name appeared several times, always in connection with these strange events. Ivy's heart raced as she flipped through the pages. The more she read, the more she realized that her grandmother was deeply connected to Salem's history, perhaps even to its magic. But there was still no definitive proof. The journal hinted at things, but it never confirmed them. Ivy spent hours in that room, poring over the journal's contents, trying to piece together the fragments of her grandmother's life. She found sketches of symbols she didn't recognize, descriptions of rituals that seemed more myth than reality. There was even a mention of a certain veil that separated the mundane from the magical, a barrier that, if crossed, would change one's understanding of the world forever. Ivy felt a strange thrill as she read, a mix of fear and fascination. Was this what her father had wanted to protect her from? Or was this the truth her grandmother had been waiting for her to discover? Chapter 5. The Town's Whispers. The whispers in town only grew louder as Halloween approached. People spoke of Ivy's grandmother with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Some admired her for her wisdom and influence, while others whispered about the strange occurrences that seemed to follow her. One day, while browsing a local bookstore, Ivy overheard two women discussing her grandmother in hushed tones. "I heard she's been here for decades," one woman said. "She hasn't aged a day." The other woman nodded. "They say she knows things that no one should know." Ivy frowned, turning away from the conversation. The whispers were getting harder to ignore. And while she wanted to believe they were just rumors, the things she had seen in the house, the way it responded to her grandmother, the journal she had found, made her wonder if there was more truth to the whispers than she'd like to admit. As Ivy left the bookstore, she felt the weight of the town's gossip following her. It was as though the whispers clung to her, weaving themselves into her thoughts. She couldn't shake the sense that Salem was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something that involved her grandmother, and perhaps even herself. Chapter 6. Halloween Night. Halloween night arrived, and Salem was more alive than ever. The streets were filled with costumed revelers. Laughter and music echoed through the town, and the air buzzed with excitement. But in her grandmother's house, things were quieter, more solemn. Ivy sat in the parlor, watching as her grandmother prepared tea. There was an air of anticipation, as if something was about to happen, though Ivy couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. As they sat together, sipping tea, Ivy couldn't help but feel the house humming with energy. It was as if the house itself was waiting for something, just like Ivy. Her grandmother set down her cup, her eyes locking onto Ivy's. "Tonight is a special night, Ivy. The veil between worlds is thin. Magic is stronger tonight." Ivy's heart skipped a beat. "Magic?" Her grandmother smiled softly. "You felt it, haven't you? The house. It's been speaking to you." Ivy's mind raced. "I've noticed things I can't explain." Her grandmother stood, walking over to the window. "The house is tied to us, Ivy, to our family. It responds to our needs, our desires. It has always been that way." Ivy swallowed hard. "And me? Does it respond to me too?" Her grandmother turned, her eyes soft but intense. Yes, you've always had a connection to this place, even before you arrived. Ivy felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, as if everything she had been questioning was slowly falling into place. But there was still one thing she needed to know. Are we witches? Her grandmother's smile was faint, almost wistful. That's not for me to say. The whispers in town, they're just stories. But you... She stepped closer, placing a hand on Ivy's shoulder. You will have to decide what you believe. Chapter 7. Accepting the Mystery. Ivy spent the rest of the night contemplating her grandmother's words. The house had been responding to her, just as it had to her grandmother. The journal, the whispers in town, the things she had seen, they all pointed to something deeper, something magical. But there was no proof, no confirmation. Her grandmother had left the answer in Ivy's hands. It was up to her to decide what was real, what was true. As the night wore on and the sounds of Halloween faded outside, Ivy felt a sense of peace settle over her. The mystery of her family, of her grandmother, might never be fully explained, but she was okay with that. Not everything needed an answer. Some things were meant to remain a mystery, to be felt rather than understood. Chapter 8. Leaving Salem. The next morning, Ivy prepared to leave Salem. As she packed her bags, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something behind, not physically, but emotionally. The town, the house, her grandmother. They had all left an imprint on her, one she knew she would carry with her forever. Her grandmother stood at the door, watching her with a soft smile. "You'll be back," she said, her voice full of certainty. Ivy smiled, nodding. "I know." As Ivy walked down the cobblestone path, the town's whispers followed her. But this time, she didn't feel the need to chase them. The truth, whatever it was, would reveal itself in time. And as she drove away from Salem, Ivy knew that, no matter what, the magic of her grandmother's house, and perhaps even her own, would always be a part of her. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Want to be the first to catch new releases? Hit the bell to stay updated. Thank you for listening.